All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are taking a deep dive into the world of Karl Marx.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, Karl Marx for philosophers.
Right.
We're going to be going beyond the surface-level stuff you might find in, like, an introductory course. We're really going to unpack the philosophical complexities of his work.
Right.
And to help us navigate this dense terrain, we've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Karl Marx.
Excellent source.
Yeah, it is an absolute goldmine of information.
Absolutely.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll not only have a solid grasp on Marx's core ideas, from alienation to historical materialism, but you'll be ready to jump into some seriously engaging philosophical discussions about his work.
Awesome.
So to kick things off, I want to just point out this really interesting fact that, Marx, despite being known primarily for his socio-political impact, actually began his intellectual journey completely immersed in ancient philosophy.
Oh, yeah, he did. He did.
Which I find fascinating.
Well, it's interesting. He actually received his PhD analyzing the ancient materialists, Democritus and Epicurus.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's wild. So I gotta ask, how does a guy who starts out studying ancient Greek philosophers end up writing the Communist Manifesto and inspiring revolutions? There's got to be a story there.
There certainly is.
Yeah.
And understanding that journey is really, really key to grasping the depth and evolution of Marx's thought.
Okay.
While his later work might seem like it's really far removed from, the musings of Democritus, you can actually trace a thread of materialist thought throughout his development. And his engagement with Hegel's dialectical method further kind of shapes his approach to analyzing history and social change.
So it's not just like this random jump from ancient philosophy to revolutionary theory.
Not at all.
There's a deeper intellectual continuity there.
Absolutely. It's crucial to see Marx's work not as a collection of just kind of isolated ideas, but as a coherent and evolving philosophical system. And one of the core concepts that really anchors that system is alienation.
Alienation, right? That is a term that gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
But it has a very specific meaning in Marxist thought.
It does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's a concept that resonates so deeply with philosophers because it delves into questions of human nature, meaning, and fulfillment.
Right.
For Marx, alienation isn't just about feeling sad or lonely. It's about a really fundamental disconnect between individuals and their true potential.
So it's not just a psychological state, but it's an objective condition that's rooted in the structure of society itself.
Exactly. Marx actually identified 4 key dimensions of alienated labor under capitalism that contribute to this sense of estrangement.
Okay, let's hear it.
So first, workers are alienated from the product of their labor. They create things that they neither own nor control.
So it's kind of like the things that we create become alien to us.
Yeah.
Like some kind of Frankenstein's monster we can't control.
That's a really vivid way to put it. So the objects that we produce take on a life of their own, driven by market forces rather than human needs. Second, workers are alienated from their own productive activity. The very act of working becomes something oppressive and dehumanizing.
So it's not just that we don't own what we create, it's that the very act of creating is alienating.
Precisely.
Okay.
Work becomes just a means to an end, earning a wage, rather than a source of genuine fulfillment.
Yeah.
So the third dimension of alienation really focuses on our relationships with others.
Okay.
Capitalism, with its emphasis on competition and self-interest,
Right.
fosters a sense of isolation and disconnection.
So instead of seeing each other as fellow human beings, we become like rivals in this zero-sum game.
That's the tragedy of it.
Yeah.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, capitalism alienates us from our species being.
Species being. Okay, now there's a philosophical term.
Right.
What does Marx mean by that?
It's a concept that captures our unique human potential for creative and meaningful engagement with the world. We're not just cogs in a machine.
Right.
We have the capacity to shape our surroundings and realize our full potential through creative work.
Okay.
But capitalism stifles that potential.
So alienation at its core is like this denial of our humanity. It's a separation from what makes us uniquely human.
That's a really profound way to put it.
Yeah.
And understanding alienation is absolutely crucial for grasping Marx's critique of capitalism and his vision for a better future.
Okay, so we've dug into alienation and its philosophical implications, but Marx didn't just stop at critiquing the present.
No, he didn't.
He also offered this, like, grand theory of history, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
It's known as historical materialism.
Right. But historical materialism often gets reduced to like a simplistic formula.
It's
like economics drives everything.
Right.
Can we unpack it in a way that does justice to its philosophical depth?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
It's so much more than economics drives everything.
Okay.
At its core, it's a way of understanding how societies change and evolve over time. And it's really deeply rooted in a materialist conception of reality.
Okay, so let's break it down. What does a materialist conception of reality actually entail?
So it means that Marx starts with the concrete conditions of human existence.
Okay.
The way we produce and reproduce our material lives.
Right.
And these material conditions, he argues, form the foundation upon which everything else is built. Our social structures, our political systems, even our ideas and beliefs.
So it's not just that economics is important, it's that it's the fundamental basis upon which everything else rests.
Exactly.
Right.
And the way we organize production, the tools we use, the division of labor, the ownership of resources, shapes the entire social order.
Okay.
Marx uses the terms forces of production and relations of production to capture this really dynamic interplay.
Okay, so remind us again, what's the difference between those two?
All right, so the forces of production are the material elements.
Okay.
Think technology, tools, raw materials, and the knowledge and skills of the workforce.
Right.
It's everything that goes into producing the goods and services that a society needs.
Okay.
And the relations of production, on the other hand, are the social relationships that arise around production.
Okay.
So they determine who owns the means of production, how labor is organized, and how the fruits of that labor are distributed.
So the forces are like the what, and the relations are like the who and the how.
That's a really good way to think about it.
Okay, all right, good.
Now, Marx argues that these forces of production are constantly developing and evolving,
Okay.
driven by human ingenuity and the pursuit of greater efficiency.
So we're always coming up with new ways to produce things. New technologies, new methods.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But here's the crucial point. As the forces of production develop, they eventually come into conflict with the existing relations of production.
So the way we're organized socially and economically can't keep up with the pace of technological change.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
This tension, this fettering of the forces of production
All right.
by outdated relations creates the conditions for social upheaval and eventually revolution.
So it's not just about bad ideas or like corrupt leaders.
Right.
It's about this fundamental mismatch between how we produce things and how our society is structured.
That's the core insight of historical materialism.
Okay.
And Marx really believed that this dynamic was playing out in his own time with the rapid development of industrial capitalism, creating the conditions for a socialist revolution.
Okay, so the conflict between the forces and relations of production is this engine that drives history forward. But how does that actually play out?
Okay.
Can you give us like a concrete example of how this fettering leads to revolution?
Okay, let's consider the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Under feudalism, the relations of production were based on land ownership and a really rigid social hierarchy.
Right.
Peasants were tied to the land, working for lords who controlled the means of production.
Right. Very static, hierarchical.
Yeah.
But how did that system start to break down?
Well, as new technologies emerged, like the printing press, improved navigation techniques, and new agricultural methods, the forces of production began to develop.
Okay.
And these advancements led to increased trade, the growth of cities, and the emergence of a new class, the bourgeoisie.
Right. The merchants, artisans, early capitalists who are accumulating wealth and challenging the old feudal order.
Exactly.
Okay.
And as the bourgeoisie grew in power and influence, the old feudal relations of production started to become a real hindrance to further economic development.
Okay.
So the feudal system, with its rigid hierarchies and land-based economy, couldn't keep up with the dynamism of this new merchant class.
Yeah.
So the feudal system, which had once been compatible with the forces of production, was now fettering their development.
Yeah.
And this tension led to social unrest, political upheaval, and eventually a series of revolutions that swept across Europe, replacing feudalism with capitalism.
So in a sense, capitalism was initially a progressive force. because it unleashed these new productive forces and created this more dynamic economic system.
That's exactly how Marx saw it.
Okay.
Capitalism, for all its flaws, was a necessary stage in the historical development of human societies.
But he also believed that capitalism itself would eventually become a fetter, leading to a new revolutionary transition.
Exactly. And that's where his analysis gets really interesting, because it leads us to consider how our current social and economic structures might be hindering the full development of human potential.
It makes you wonder, what are the fetters of our time?
Yeah.
And what kind of new social order might emerge from the contradictions of late-stage capitalism?
Those are questions that continue to animate philosophical debates.
Oh, yeah.
And social movements around the world.
Absolutely. And they underscore the enduring power of Marx's thought, even as the world has changed so dramatically since his time.
Indeed.
Okay, so we've unpacked alienation and historical materialism.
Right.
And it's clear that Marx's thought is deeply philosophical in nature.
Absolutely.
But he also offered this really scathing critique of the economic workings of capitalism, didn't he?
He did.
Let's dive into that next.
All right. Yeah, Marx's critique of the economic workings of capitalism, it's rooted in a deep understanding of value and labor.
Okay.
He goes beyond, simply pointing out greed or unfair practices.
Right.
He dissects the very mechanisms that perpetuate inequality and exploitation.
Okay.
And, a central concept in that critique is the labor theory of value.
Yeah, the labor theory of value.
It's one of those ideas that's both fascinating and controversial.
It's essential for understanding Marx's analysis of exploitation under capitalism. So
right.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more.
Right. So the labor theory of value, as Marx articulates it, states that the value of a commodity is ultimately determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it.
Break that down for us a little bit.
Okay.
What does socially necessary labor time even mean?
Yeah, it's not just about how long it takes one person to make something.
Okay.
It's about the average amount of time it takes to produce a good using the prevailing techniques and technology in a given society. Think of it as the baseline of efficiency for producing that particular commodity.
So it's like a societal average.
Yeah, for production time.
Gotcha.
And it's important to emphasize that Marx is talking about abstract labor here.
Okay.
Not the concrete labor of any individual worker.
Right. Okay, but why does this matter? How does the labor theory of value connect to Marx's critique of capitalism?
All right, so through the labor theory of value, Marx explains how surplus value, and therefore profit, arises under capitalism. Remember, workers sell their labor power to capitalists in exchange for wages, but the value of that labor power is less than the value of the goods they produce.
So workers are paid less than the value they create.
Exactly. And the difference between the value a worker creates and the value of their labor power is what Marx calls surplus value. And the surplus value is the source of capitalist profit.
So the more surplus value capitalists can extract, the more profit they make.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that leads to an inherent conflict of interest between workers and capitalists. Capitalists are driven to maximize profits by squeezing more and more surplus value out of their workers.
But doesn't that lead to problems? Because workers need to be paid enough to survive.
Exactly.
To continue working.
Yeah, that's where the concept of necessary labor comes in.
Okay.
Necessary labor is the portion of a worker's workday that produces enough value to cover the cost of their wages.
Okay.
Basically, the cost of keeping them alive and able to work.
So it's the bare minimum they need.
Yes.
Okay.
But here's the crucial point. Workers typically work beyond that necessary labor time. They continue producing value beyond what's needed to cover their wages.
And that extra value goes to the capitalist.
Precisely.
As profit.
Exactly. That's what Marx calls surplus labor.
Okay.
And it's the source of exploitation under capitalism.
So this is where the term wage slavery comes from.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's important to note that Marx isn't arguing that, all capitalists are evil or intentionally malicious. He's saying that exploitation is a structural feature of the capitalist system itself.
So it's built into the very fabric
of
how production and distribution are organized.
Precisely. The drive to maximize profit inevitably leads to the exploitation of labor.
Now, if the labor theory of value is the foundation of Marx's economic critique, doesn't it run into some problems when we consider, like, the complexities of the real world,
Right.
prices aren't always directly proportional to the labor involved.
Right, right. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
You're highlighting a crucial debate that has raged around the labor theory of value. Critics point out that factors like supply and demand, competition, and consumer preferences also influence prices. Like, if the value of a product is solely based on the labor that goes into it, why are some handmade goods so cheap?
Right.
While some, mass-produced items can be quite expensive.
Right. This is known as the transformation problem.
Okay.
The challenge of reconciling the labor theory of value with the realities of market prices.
Right.
And Marx himself acknowledged this issue.
And attempted to address it in the third volume of Capital.
Okay, so he didn't just ignore this apparent contradiction.
Not at all.
Okay.
He argued that market prices fluctuate around a center of gravity.
Okay.
Determined by the socially necessary labor time.
Right.
However, his explanation hasn't fully satisfied all critics.
Sure, so it remains a point of contention.
It does.
Even among those who are sympathetic to Marx's broader critique.
It does. It's important to be aware of this debate when you're engaging with Marx's economic theories.
Yeah.
Even if you have some reservations about the labor theory of value.
Right.
It's crucial to see how it functions within his larger system of analysis.
Okay, so the labor theory of value might have its limitations, but it's still a crucial part of Marx's framework.
Yeah.
For understanding exploitation and the dynamics of capitalism.
Absolutely.
But it's not the only concept to use it to critique this system, is it? What about this idea of commodity fetishism?
Commodity fetishism.
Yeah.
Now, this is where Marx's analysis gets really, really interesting.
All right.
It delves into the psychological and cultural dimensions of capitalism.
All right, break it down for us.
Okay.
What is commodity fetishism?
All right, so it's the idea that under capitalism, we tend to treat commodities, the things we buy and sell, as if they have intrinsic value, independent of the labor that went into creating them.
So we forget about the human beings who made them and just see them as like objects with value.
Exactly. We become fixated on the exchange value, the price tag, and lose sight of the social relations and human effort behind that product.
Right.
Marx argues that this fetishism is a consequence of the way capitalism structures our relationship to the things we produce and consume.
It's like we're worshiping things.
Yeah.
Instead of recognizing the people who made them.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And Marx argued that this commodity fetishism obscures the exploitative nature of capitalism.
How so?
Well, if we only focus on the exchange value of things, we lose sight of the fact that profit is ultimately derived from the surplus labor of workers.
So commodity fetishism hides the true source of value creation.
Precisely. It creates a kind of illusion that the market is this fair, impartial system where everyone gets what they deserve.
But in reality, the system is rigged in favor of those who own the means of production.
That's a core element of Marx's critique.
Yeah.
Commodity fetishism helps to naturalize and perpetuate those inequalities.
Okay, so commodity fetishism plays a role in obscuring exploitation. But how does this concept connect back to alienation, which we talked about earlier?
They're deeply, deeply intertwined.
Okay.
When we treat commodities as if they have an independent existence, separate from the labor that created them, we become alienated from our own creative power.
So it's not just that we're alienated from the products of our labor, but also from the very act of production itself.
Exactly. And that alienation extends to our relationships with each other.
Right.
Instead of seeing each other as fellow human beings, we start to view each other as consumers and competitors in the marketplace.
So capitalism not only alienates us from our work, but also from our social connections.
Precisely. It creates a system where individual self-interest often overrides collective well-being.
Okay, so we've got this pretty bleak picture of capitalism. Built on exploitation, masked by commodity fetishism, leading to widespread alienation. But if we follow Marx's theory of historical materialism, wouldn't capitalism eventually just give way to like a new, more egalitarian system?
In the hope, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Marx really believed that the seeds of capitalism's destruction were sown within the system itself.
So it's like a self-destruct button.
Yes.
Built into the very fabric of capitalism.
That's a striking analogy.
Yeah.
So Marx identified several inherent contradictions within capitalism that he believed would eventually lead to its downfall.
Okay.
One of the most significant is the tendency for the rate of profit to fall.
Wait, if capitalists are all about maximizing profit,
right,
how could the rate of profit actually decline?
Yeah, it's a complex process, but it boils down to the way capitalism incentivizes technological innovation.
Right.
Capitalists are constantly seeking ways to increase efficiency,
right,
lower costs, right?
Sure, that's how they stay competitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. As they invest more in machinery and technology, what Marx called constant capital, they reduce the proportion of their investment in labor power, variable capital.
Okay.
And since profit, according to Marx, is only generated through the exploitation of labor.
Right. So wouldn't that mean less profit for the capitalist?
Exactly. The more they automate and reduce their reliance on labor, the lower their rate of profit becomes. Okay.
And this creates a fundamental tension at the heart of capitalism.
So there's this inherent conflict between the drive for technological innovation and the source of profit itself.
Precisely.
Okay.
And Marx believed that this contradiction would eventually reach a breaking point, leading to economic crises, social unrest, and potentially the conditions for a revolutionary transformation.
Okay, so the falling rate of profit is like one ticking time bomb within capitalism. What are some other contradictions that Marx identified?
Another major contradiction lies in the inherent instability of capitalist markets.
What do you mean by instability?
So capitalism, by its very nature, is prone to cycles of boom and bust. Factors like overproduction, speculation, and financial bubbles create a really volatile, unpredictable economic landscape.
We've certainly seen those play out throughout history.
Yeah.
Think of the Great Depression.
The more recent financial crisis in 2008.
Exactly. And Marx argued that these crises would become increasingly severe as capitalism matured. The system's own internal dynamics would generate instability, potentially paving the way for a new social order.
Okay, so these inherent contradictions, the falling rate of profit, the tendency towards crisis, they're like cracks in the foundation of capitalism.
Yeah.
But how did Marx envision the transition to a post-capitalist society?
That brings us to his theory of revolution.
All right, let's talk revolution.
Okay.
But remember, we're approaching this from a philosophical perspective.
Right.
So beyond like the imagery of barricades and uprisings, what are the deeper philosophical ideas underpinning Marx's theory of revolution?
So for Marx, revolution wasn't just about violence and overthrow. It was about a fundamental transformation of social relations and, crucially, a shift in consciousness. He believed that the transition from capitalism to communism would be driven by the proletariat, the working class.
Why the working class?
Because they are the ones most directly exploited under capitalism. They experience the alienation, the dehumanization, the inherent contradictions of the system firsthand. And they have the collective power through their labor to bring the system to a halt.
So it's not just about changing the economic system. It's about changing the way people think.
Exactly. Remember, Marx believed that ideology plays a powerful role in maintaining the status quo. So for a revolution to be successful, people need to break free from the dominant capitalist ideology and develop a new socialist worldview.
So it's about raising consciousness.
Yes.
It's about helping people see the system for what it is, envision a better alternative.
Precisely.
Okay.
And for Marx, this process of consciousness raising was so closely linked to the struggle itself. He argued that it's through collective action, through organizing and fighting for their interests, that the working class develops a sense of solidarity and a new understanding of their place in the world.
So it's a transformative process.
Absolutely. It's not just about seizing power. It's about creating a new way of relating to each other and to the world around us.
Okay, so we've got Exploitation, alienation, the contradictions of capitalism, and the revolutionary potential of the working class.
Right.
But what did Marx envision for a post-capitalist society? What would this communist utopia, or perhaps, as Marx might prefer to call it, a society that transcends the limitations and injustices of capitalism actually look like?
Ah, the communist utopia.
Yeah.
Or perhaps, as Marx might prefer to call it, a society that transcends the limitations and injustices of capitalism.
Yeah.
This is where things get a little bit more speculative.
Okay.
As Marx was famously reluctant to provide detailed blueprints.
Right. He didn't want to fall into the trap of utopian thinking.
Right.
That he criticized so fiercely.
Exactly.
But he did offer some hints, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
And those hints offer us a glimpse into a radically different way of organizing social life.
Okay.
One of the most fundamental principles of this post-capitalist society is the abolition of private property.
Whoa, hold on. Abolish private property entirely. That sounds pretty radical.
It is, but remember, Marx is talking specifically about the abolition of private property in the means of production.
Okay.
The factories, the land, the resources that are used to create wealth.
So instead of those being owned by individuals or corporations, they would be like collectively owned and controlled.
Exactly. Marx believed that collective ownership would eliminate the exploitation inherent in the capitalist system.
So no more capitalists profiting off the labor of others.
That's the idea. The means of production would be held in common, and the fruits of labor would be distributed equitably. But the abolition of private property is just one element of Marx's vision. He also emphasized the importance of ending the division of labor.
Wait, the division of labor? You mean the idea that people specialize in different tasks?
Yeah.
Isn't that supposed to be a good thing? It makes us more efficient?
That's the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
But Marx argued that the division of labor as it exists under capitalism is deeply alienating and dehumanizing.
How so?
It forces people into narrow, specialized roles, often performing repetitive, meaningless tasks. They become cogs in a machine rather than fully realized individuals.
So it's not just about who owns the means of production, it's about how work itself is structured.
Precisely. Marx envisioned a society where individuals would have the opportunity to develop a wide range of skills and talents, engaging in various forms of creative, fulfilling work.
So instead of being stuck in one job for our entire lives, we could explore different passions, contribute in different ways.
That's the essence of Marx's vision. He believed that this kind of free and creative labor would be a key element of human flourishing under communism.
Okay, so we've got collective ownership and the end of the division of labor. What else did Marx envision for this post-capitalist society?
Another key principle is the idea of from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
Okay, that sounds familiar. It's often associated with like socialist ideals, right?
Exactly. It encapsulates Marx's vision of a truly egalitarian society where everyone contributes based on their capabilities and receives based on their needs.
So it's about meeting everyone's basic needs and ensuring that no one is left behind.
Precisely. And this principle extends beyond just material needs. Marx also emphasized the importance of social and cultural fulfillment. Envisioning a society where everyone had access to education, healthcare, and the arts.
So it's not just about putting food on the table.
No.
It's about creating a society that fosters human development and well-being in all its dimensions.
That's a core element of Marx's vision. And this brings us to another crucial and perhaps the most radical aspect of his thought. The withering away of the state.
We touched on this earlier, but it's worth exploring in more detail. So in a communist society, the state as we know it would cease to exist.
That was Marx's prediction. He believed that as class antagonisms dissolved and social needs were met, the state would gradually lose its function and eventually disappear.
So no more government, no more laws, no more police. It's hard to imagine.
It's definitely a radical vision. But remember, for Marx, the state was not some neutral arbiter of justice. It was an instrument of class rule.
A tool used to maintain the power of the dominant class.
So in a classless society, there would be no need for such an instrument.
That was Marx's argument.
Okay.
He believed that in a communist society,
Okay.
social order would be maintained through cooperation and solidarity rather than coercion and force.
It sounds almost too idealistic to be true.
It is.
Yeah.
And whether such a stateless society is actually possible is a question that has been debated endlessly.
Right, because even if we could abolish private property and eliminate the state, wouldn't human greed and the lust for power just find new ways to express themselves?
Those are valid concerns.
Yeah.
And they highlight the challenges of translating Marx's abstract vision into concrete reality.
Okay, so the withering away of the state is another piece of the communist puzzle.
Right.
We're still missing a crucial piece. The transition from capitalism to communism.
Right.
How did Marx envision that actually happening? Well, this is where we circle back to his theory of revolution.
Okay.
And it's where his thinking gets really, really interesting because it pushes us to consider how social change actually occurs.
Okay, let's dive back into revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a call to action, like an invitation to really engage with the forces that shape our world and to fight for a more just and equitable future, you know?
Right.
And I think that brings us to like a really crucial question.
Okay.
Especially for philosophers who are grappling with Marx's ideas.
Yeah.
How do we apply his thinking to the world we live in today? It's been over 170 years since the Communist Manifesto was published.
It's true.
The world has changed in ways that Marx could never have imagined.
Yeah, it has.
Right.
And yet his analysis of capitalism, his insights into power and ideology remain, strikingly relevant.
Yeah.
The challenges that we're facing today, global inequality, climate change, the rise of authoritarianism, demand that we engage with the kind of systemic critique that Marx offered.
So how can we, like, as philosophers, bridge that gap between Marx's, 19th century analysis and the complexities of the 21st century?
It's tough, but we have to.
Yeah.
We have to try.
What are some of the key questions we should be asking ourselves?
Well, one of the most pressing questions, I think,
Okay.
is how technology has reshaped the dynamics of capitalism
Okay.
and the prospects for social change.
Okay.
So Marx lived in an era of rapid industrialization, but he could hardly have envisioned the digital revolution, the rise of artificial intelligence, the globalized economy we live in today.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point because technology has, in many ways, both exacerbated and mitigated the contradictions in capitalism that Marx identified.
Exactly.
So.
On the one hand, technology has led to unprecedented levels of productivity, global interconnectedness. But on the other hand, it's also contributed to widening inequality, job displacement, and new forms of exploitation.
Right. Think about the gig economy, the rise of automation.
Yeah.
The concentration of wealth in the hands of these tech giants.
Right.
These are all issues that Marx couldn't have fully anticipated.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So as philosophers, we need to grapple with how these technological advancements have reshaped the class struggle, the nature of labor, and the possibilities for collective action.
It makes you wonder, if Marx were alive today, what would he make of the internet?
Right.
Social media, cryptocurrency.
Exactly.
Yeah. Would he see these technologies as ultimately serving the interests of capital? Or could they potentially be harnessed? For a more egalitarian future.
Yeah.
And how do his concepts of alienation and commodity fetishism play out in a digital age where our lives are increasingly mediated by screens and algorithms?
All important questions.
Huge questions.
We need to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really just highlights the enduring power of Marx's thought to provoke us, challenge us, and inspire us to think differently about the world.
Absolutely.
Okay.
His work remains a vital resource for understanding the complexities of our time.
Absolutely.
And for envisioning a more just and humane future.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Karl Marx.
Yeah.
Karl Marx for
philosophers.
We hope you found this exploration as stimulating as we have.
I did, yeah.
Awesome. We encourage you to continue grappling with Marx's ideas.
Absolutely.
To question, to debate, and to apply his insights to the challenges that we face today.
Yeah.
Because as we've seen, even though he was writing in the 19th century, his analysis of capitalism, his critique of power, and his vision for a better future remain as relevant and provocative as ever.
They do.
Until next time, keep diving.